Welcome to Crossroads. A new congressional report claims, at least, that if the United States right now were to go to war with the Chinese Communist Party, that the United States would lose. Now look, this July 30th report comes from the Commission on the National Defense Strategy, and it says that the U.S. defense industrial base would not be able to produce what the United States would need to win this type of conflict. Now look, is this really the case? Well, I want to go over some of the main claims in this report and kind of analyze it a bit. Now this is RAND, and here's what it has to say. China and Russia are major powers that seek to undermine U.S. influence. The 2022 National Defense Strategy, NDS, recognizes these nations as the top threats to the United States and declares China to be the, quote, pacing challenge, meaning, of course, pacing over the course of time. The CCP is the biggest threat, based on the strength of its military and economy and its intent to exert dominance regionally and globally. Now, look, we've discussed this on the show. The Chinese Communist Party, of course, is kind of the long-term threat as far as U.S. defense, government, as far as they're concerned. Russia is more of the immediate threat. The issue with Russia, of course, is because it's burned through so much of its military to wage the war in Ukraine that it can't really keep that going without the support of the CCP. In terms of national defense and strategy, Russia is still seen as an issue, mainly because of that war, but it's understood that without the support of China, that whole thing would come to an end. What they're now looking at are the long-term goals of where things are heading. And they're understanding that basically the Chinese Communist Party has ambitions to overthrow the United States as the kind of de facto world leader and replace it with its own systems of power. They're recognizing this now. And so they're looking at, well, how do we challenge China? How do we push back against this? If the CCP were to actually start a war, like a hot war, because, I mean, look, let's be honest with ourselves. Look at Iran right now. Israel right now is talking about preemptively launching attacks against Iran because Iran's talking about attacking Israel right now because they recently assassinated a couple of top officials, including one with Hamas, in Iran. That is looking to pop off right now. The CCP is one of the major backers on that, on the opposite side of Israel. The CCP is backing, of course, Russia. The CCP is working with other countries, even in Latin America right now with the recent elections in Venezuela. The CCP is backing the Maduro regime. The U.S. has determined the opposition party actually won the election. There's a division, in other words, among global alliances, and the CCP is backing the side that undermines U.S. interest. This is the trend, and I'll tell you right now, it's just starting. Now, on this report, when they're talking about, well, how do we push back against this? What they're saying is this. The Commission finds that in many ways, China is outpacing the United States and has largely negated the U.S. military advantage in the Western Pacific through 2 decades of focused military investment. Without significant changes by the United States, the balance of power will continue to shift in China's favor. And they say China's overall annual spending on defense is estimated at as much as $711 billion. And the Chinese government in March 2024 announced an increase in annual defense spending of 7.2%. They note that Russia will devote 29% of its federal budget this year on national defense as it continues to reconstitute its military and economy after its failed initial invasion of Ukraine in 2022. They say Russia possesses considerable strategic, space, and cyber capabilities, and under Vladimir Putin seeks a return to its global leadership role of the Cold War. Again, we talked before about the idea of the Eurasian Empire, which is part of the goal shared by both the CCP and by Russia. Now, it notes that China and Russia's No Limits Partnership formed in February 2022, just days before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has only deepened and broadened to include a military and economic partnership with Iran and North Korea, each of which presents its own significant threat to U.S. interests. This new alignment of nations opposed to U.S. interests creates a real risk, if not likelihood, that a conflict anywhere could become a multi-theater or global war. World War III, in other words. So what they're suggesting is that we're facing a security environment globally where the CCP and Russia are becoming more aggressive. Other countries like Iran are becoming more aggressive. North Korea is becoming more aggressive. They're threatening war. In fact, as we're speaking right now, Iran is talking about launching strikes against Israel. Israel's talking about launching strikes against Iran. The U.S. is positioning its military to respond to that situation. The CCP is backing the other side. Any conflict that starts right now could trigger a world war, a new one. Same thing in Venezuela right now. The CCP is backing Maduro. The U.S. is backing the opposition. If that turns into a civil war, we could get pulled into something down there as well. This is the case right now, and it can actually expand. Now look, this is actually all true based on this report, and I would actually add to that report the likelihood that if a world war actually broke out, we wouldn't just be facing wars against nations. We'd also be facing threats from global terror networks. We'd be facing threats from large-scale threats like subversive groups within the United States. Think mass protests, think popular movements, think the kinds of protests we saw, during the hippie movements of the 1960s. Those kinds of things, but not led by, Soviet Russia, but instead by this network that the CCP and Russia have established, also using very similar tactics. Now keep in mind also, on the point of Russia and China with their defense spending. Now look, some people would be like, well, $711 billion in China, they're a big country, how much money does the US spend on defense? It's important to note, their money goes further than ours does. The cost of, for example, having a soldier in China versus having a soldier in the United States is significantly less. They get paid less. The money, of course, is much more devalued than ours. The pensions, the long-term pay, the retirement, all these things, they're not the same as ours. The cost of sustaining an armed force in their country is significantly cheaper. The other side, too, is because of our kind of defense industrial complex. It costs a lot of money to buy anything in America. If you, for example, look at the cost of a can of beans, for example, when it comes to U.S. military spending, normally if you buy bulk, you're going to pay less. For some reason, with a lot of the defense contracts, they tend to actually pay a lot more money. There was a recent congressional hearing, for example, where a congressman held up a bag of bolts, basically, and talked about, in the store, you could buy these for 50 cents each, and they're selling it for thousands.
This, Mr. Secretary, is a bag of bushings. This bag of bushings, stamped out by machinists, they need a high school diploma. It's not anything high tech about this. All of this bag is compliant with the FAA specifications. How much do you think the Air Force pays for this bag of bushings?
I don't know, Congressman.
$90,000. This is a $90,000 bag of bushings that you need for any jet turbine engine just to operate. So the exorbitant cost due to DoD only buying commercial parts from the OEMs, which is essentially sole source, is literally driving us out of business. I mean, the interest on our debt alone is now exceeding, for the first time in American history, the entire defense budget. We can't afford it anymore.
The amount of money we spend on some of the same materials is exponentially higher because of the way that government contracts work when it comes to defense spending. The other side, too, though, is that the U.S. military is recognizing this. One of the main reasons is they're looking at the costs of the F-35 jet or the F-22, the Raptor and so on. And they're noting that the way we're heading with defense spending is that it costs so much to buy a single jet that, maybe in the future our entire Air Force is going to just be a handful of jets that cost pretty much our entire defense budget. Whereas countries like China, in other words, they're looking at bulk. They're looking at mass force. They're looking at basically tools to overwhelm our defenses because there's just too dang many of them. It's the idea that, hey, we know you guys have limited ammo, and we're going to throw something to burn every bullet you have, and we're still going to have, human wave tactics happening through these unconventional means. It's that type of thing. Now, given that, of course, you can understand a war would be devastating in human terms. But the US is also now looking at going the other way. They're looking at, for example, the hellscape strategy we discussed recently. They're looking at swarms of drones. They're looking at low-cost, small rather than large vehicles. One of the main things they've even witnessed, for example, in the war in Ukraine is that tanks may even become obsolete. They're very large targets, they're very expensive targets, and you hit one of them with a little tiny drone dropping a bomb big enough to take it out, it's gone. That is the future of war. Small, fast, cheap. But on the note of China, again, when you look at their defense spending, their money goes significantly further than ours does when it comes to defense spending. Now, you could argue, of course, the quality is significantly lower as well. Remember, of course, when Russia did its initial invasion of Ukraine, one of the reasons why it turned from, projected 2-week war to just seize a few regions, right? They wanted to seize Crimea, they wanted to seize a few other parts. That has dragged on now for more than 2 years. And why was that? It's because they got stalled. When they had their whole, it was a blitzkrieg tactic, right? Lightning war. They were rolling in. They wanted to immediately take this, lock it down, lock out Ukraine. This is our territory now. They got stuck on the road. They had a huge convoy stuck in the mud. And one of the reasons for that was they had cheap China-made tires on their military vehicles, and they were getting flat tires. They didn't have logistics systems set up to refuel things. Again, cheap, made-in-China military, it breaks down, it doesn't work. So there's two sides to it, of course. But, of course, when it comes to defending your country, you can't count on one side just running into disaster. You have to look at what they project is the actual functional threat. And so based on that, they are looking at the CCP's objectives with this. Now, look, remember also, during World War II in the United States, a lot of our military equipment was made through normal domestic manufacturers. Car makers were making tanks. You had vehicle makers making, the planes we were flying overhead. We had a lot of domestic sourcing for natural resources because, again, when you're understanding what makes an industrialized nation, well, it's not just the manufacturing houses, it's the supply chains, it's the resources, it's the entire system that props that up. We as a country lost a lot of our manufacturing base. We burned through a lot of our oil reserves. Remember, of course, that we had a lot of that and they've been burning through that rather than allowing for domestic production. And we still depend on other countries for a lot of the key components, steel and otherwise, that we need to manufacture military equipment. Not to mention some of the more rare materials like rare earth minerals, a lot of which come from China. And even not to mention, basic goods like medicines, which if you're in a war, you're going to need a lot of that as well. Now, look, remember also, a lot of U.S. defense spending has gone to Ukraine. And so when they talk about the lack of U.S. military budget to take on a future China threat, this is also something to keep in mind. The U.S. actually has been essentially funding a full-scale war. We are, of course, using our ammunition. We're using the parts you need to manufacture that ammunition. A lot of it is going to Ukraine, and that is for an actual war with Russia right now. And a lot's also going to Israel, although to a much lesser degree by comparison. Now look, another key part with this all, the U.S. is actually still manufacturing a lot of military equipment. We're still making bombs, we're still making tanks, we're still making all this stuff, but a lot of it is going to Ukraine. In other words, as the U.S. is manufacturing this, we're not just having it, waiting for our own military to use in a potential war with China. A lot of it is going to Ukraine. A lot of it's being destroyed, but of course it's still being pumped out. And so the manufacturing base is functioning, but it's supporting a different war. In other words, our own military, as this report notes, may not have the reserves right now or the ammo on store to fight this kind of war, because one of the main arguments is we don't actually have the ammunition we need. We're manufacturing it, but it's going to an actual war with Russia right now. And remember also, though, because of that, a lot of damage has also been done to the Russian military, to the extent really that Russia would have a hard time, at least in the short term, running any kind of large-scale war for a while outside of Ukraine. In fact, even now, they wouldn't be able to keep the war going there without the CCP helping them prop it up. But also, there's something important to note. One thing that is often not discussed when it comes to U.S. defense spending on Ukraine or other countries, where does that money go? If the U.S. gives $1 billion to Zelensky to help fight the war against Russia, where does that money go? Well, a lot of it comes right back to the United States. When they use that defense spending, when we give defense spending to Taiwan or to other countries, a lot of the money comes right back to buy U.S. military equipment. In fact, a lot of times the money they allocate is not like they give them suitcases of cash. It's actually in terms of providing defense, materials or vehicles or whatever else. It goes right back, in other words, into our own defense industrial base. And that is one of the ways, unfortunately, or fortunately, when we look at it, that is one of the ways that the defense industrial complex stays in business, right? Because remember, with the U.S. military, we don't privatize a lot of that. We're not like China, where, for example, their defense industrial base is government run. We're not like a lot of other countries where, again, it's all under the government. In America, we have private businesses that manufacture the vehicles and the guns and the equipment for the most part. That has its ups and downs. The up is, of course, the benefit of it is that we are able to innovate in ways that no other country can. The technological scale of our military is above and beyond anything pretty much anywhere in the world. The downside of it is we pay a whole lot more money for it. And of course, a lot of that goes to research and development, which other countries then steal from us, like China, for example, but that's another issue. But back to this note. With the exception of money that's going to pay for things like pensions and such in Ukraine, because some of our defense spending is going to pay like money to keep their country running, a lot of the other money is actually coming right back into the U.S. economy, and it's actually bolstering our defense industry. Now, look, this report warns of the unrestricted warfare threat of the Chinese Communist Party going beyond, in other words, normal military threats. We talked about this more after we come back from a quick break.